Hey everyone, this is Soph, and you're listening to the Beyond Pain and Fatigue podcast, where together we'll explore the complexity of chronic pain, fatigue, and invisible illnesses. Hi everyone, and welcome back to Beyond Pain and Fatigue. I am Sophie Shepherd, and today I am very excited to welcome Rob Nash to join us. Rob is an integrative exercise physiologist and chronic pain and fatigue recovery coach with over 12 years of experience working with people living with chronic pain, fatigue, and dysautonomic conditions. He also has a background in myotherapy, though now works one-on-one supporting clients through education, coaching, and highly individualized guidance. Rob takes a holistic, integrative approach that sits alongside medical care, focusing on stabilizing symptoms, rebuilding capacity, and helping people work towards meaningful health and life goals without repeated crashes. Based in Melbourne, he works entirely via telehealth and supports clients across Australia. You can find his work at healthrive.com.au. And while he does have some social media accounts, he's deliberately very low-key there due to some philosophical disagreements with Meta and the attention economy. And I think let's forget, ME, CFS and exercise. I think that maybe should be the takeaway for a lot of people listening to this episode, Rob.
Absolutely.
I'm very excited to have you joining me today. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. I sound really good on paper, don't I?
Yeah, I know.
Nice.
It's great. There's so much that we want to talk to today, and I'm really excited, particularly to discuss a bit more about exercise and movement within the context of ME/CFS, because I know this is an area that you do a lot of work in, and it's definitely an area that I work in as well. But, I think from a personal experience as well is something quite close to my heart, and really keen to get into that. But we are kind of, I guess, working from a couple of shared maybe assumptions or understandings around some of the principles with exercise in ME/CFS that I'm really conscious that are not necessarily widely known or held. And I think just to make a few things really clear for anyone who's listening, as a bit of a disclaimer before we get to chatting about movement and exercise in ME, just to lay a few of the ground rules, so to speak, so that it's really clear to anyone's listening the perspective we're working from and the caveats on everything we're going to talk about today. So I guess everything that we discuss today, we want to make really clear that we are not pushing that, people should be pushing or exercising through symptoms. It's very clear from the research, ME is not just a deconditioning, and exercise isn't a cure for ME/CFS, although sometimes it is presented that is the case. That is not what we are going to be talking about or saying today. And we stand by the fact that, if activity or movement is triggering post-exertional malaise or those significant crashes after, then that is a clear signal to stop or scale back, and there can be risk in that. And we just want to acknowledge too that, everyone's recovery and response to exercise is going to be different. So no matter how carefully things are approached, there are going to be some people who may not ever meaningfully increase their capacity. And that's not a failure on them. That's the nature of ME/CFS as a disease, and everyone's responses to exercise, even the best possible exercise or any treatment, may not necessarily lead to gains in capacity. And that's a shift that we kind of need to see across healthcare and understanding that we want to see health professionals take on as well. That's not to say that we're not doing everything we can to help people improve their capacity, but we need to recognize those limits. And just to acknowledge too that, we might talk about maybe the role that physio or EP has in management of ME/CFS, but I think it's really important that we acknowledge that good understanding of ME/CFS is not the baseline across the professions. I know my undergraduate training, I don't know about yours, Rob, but mine included nothing about chronic fatigue and post-exertional malaise. And I think it's important to acknowledge that it's not inherently safe necessarily to go see, a random physio or EP, because I guess recognize the risk that there have been a lot of people who have experienced harm because of very well-meaning but maybe just less informed physios and EPs who have maybe accidentally pushed things a bit too far because they haven't had that understanding. So I feel like those are the main disclaimers. That felt very long and winded, but I feel like it's really important to get out there. Is there anything you could think of or add to that, Rob, that, that I've missed?
No, I mean, that's very thorough. Yeah. So I concur with absolutely everything that you just said there. I really don't have anything to add. I'm sure we'll get into some further discussions about all of those sorts of things. And look, I remember there was about one or two slides, embedded in a like one of my neuro subjects, in uni, where ME/CFS was touched on. And it was, yeah, literally one or two slides, probably one slide, really, let's be fair, and it was just a couple of dot points about what it is. And there was no coverage about like, well, what do you do with somebody when they have this sort of thing? So, but that's just a bit of a reflection of the medical literature around it, I think, or at the time anyway. I know COVID's maybe given us a bit of, injected a bit of bit more attention and funding into this because of the similarities. So that's good that some of the research has been accelerated around that sort of thing. I'd love to see whether any unis are doing a good job of educating people, their graduates around this sort of stuff these days.
Yeah.
Mm,
I mean, I don't know. I haven't recently spoken to many new grads about that specifically, but yeah, I would be interested. I think intuitively you would think, post-pandemic with, COVID and everything happening, that there would be maybe more awareness and more of a push. But at the same time, I also know that quite often there's a lot of competing interests within undergraduate programs, and it's
yeah.
sometimes difficult to find space for lots of
Where do you
things.
put this stuff in? Yeah.
Exactly. So yeah, who knows? But I agree. I think it's a really important thing. And yeah, so I guess I mean we kind of pre-framed the episode a little bit there, and I guess the big reason that, I'm so excited to be able to chat more to you today about this topic is I think there's again plenty of evidence now that's really showing that exercise in ME/CFS can be quite challenging and really needs to be treated with, quite a degree of caution. We have seen recent guidelines be published that really sort of say that, look, graded exercise therapy is something that shouldn't be undertaken for this cohort. So it's not just that it isn't a recommended treatment, it's actively recommended against for
Mm,
people with ME. And, there's been a lot of, I guess, controversy and discussion and confusion, particularly around maybe some of the terms and language we use around exercise, movement, capacity, all these things. And then amidst all of that, the overwhelming thing that I've found is that we can look at the guidelines and it tells us, yes, we shouldn't do GET, we shouldn't use exercise, we have to be really careful. But I think the thing that I've struggled with is that when you then go into the clinic, you're working with people, real people,
mm,
and these are people who, quite often, not always, but I've often had patients who might have been really, really active sporting people before they've developed ME. And so I can look at the guidelines and say, look, exercise is not curative. We shouldn't be, routinely recommending exercise, as part of treatment for ME. But yet I've got somebody who wants to be exercising, and like that is something that gives them joy. It's something that, improves their mental health, that they are so committed to doing. And I think there's kind of been a lack of, I guess, guidelines as to maybe how we can start to approach movement and exercise in a more nuanced way based on the
mm.
person, so that we're still preserving safety. We're not pushing into PEM, but maybe we might be able to help someone kind of navigate that and make sure that they are still able to, I guess, make decisions and be supported to do things in the way that they want to do. And I think that's a really hard space. But I guess what's
Yeah.
your experience been? Because you work a lot in this space as an exercise physiologist. I'd imagine that exercise and movement is something that, people are seeing you pretty often for. I guess
Yeah.
what's been your experience with that and kind of marrying up the guidelines and the protocols with clinical practice and the reality of how people are showing up?
Yeah. I mean, one key word that was in there is nuance. I think what's published out there in the research and in the guidelines is very, very black and white these days. There is a section on GET in the NICE guidelines, and yeah, categorically says do not do GET, and that can also, I think, that can be interpreted as do not do exercise at all as well. But yeah, I think, nuance is definitely needed because yes, we are dealing with people from the public, and, most people really do these days really do value movement and exercise, and understand the health benefits of it, and often do have, or have had an exercising or physically active background. And then yes, of course, you've got athletes, really highly trained people who can also get ME/CFS, and maybe it's also termed overtraining syndrome with those sorts of people. That can be a whole discussion. If we want to zoom out and take a really holistic view of treating somebody, then we've got to understand that people do want to be exercising. People really do want to move their bodies, feel fit and strong, and all of that sort of stuff. And especially for somebody who has been an athlete or, yeah, that, coming from that background, that is almost their entire identity. And yeah, we know that they're going to have better outcomes if we can bring a lot more of their life back, honor their identity as well. So yeah, I think it is it can be tricky to follow those guidelines to a T. Because if we were to do that, we would say to everyone who walks into the door, well, we need to stop exercise first and foremost. And I mean, that's sort of looking at exercise through a hobby, I suppose, a hobby's lifestyle sort of lens. Then we've just got people who fundamentally need to be moving their bodies, and maybe they're not calling it, maybe it's not called exercise, maybe it's called physical movement or activity. And they might be doing that for a job, or they might be doing that because they have little children who need to be picked up, and those kids might be 20 kilos, so they're going to be exerting their bodies in those ways. We absolutely need to acknowledge that, physical exertion can cause PEM, often does, but we've just got to figure out, well, how can we find some nuanced middle ground where we can keep some of that on board while just helping the person understand their limitations and trying to avoid PEM, so they can do things in a sustainable way.
And really good points. And I think that kind of mirrors a lot of the thinking that I've had with this is it's, I mean, the safety has to come first and foremost, right? And I don't think we're in agreement on that, right? Like,
Yeah.
we definitely don't want people, pushing to the extent where they're pushing into PEM, because we know that, PEM isn't just a temporary crash necessarily. It's not like people feel bad for a day and then they're over it. We know that
Mm,
there are a lot of people who have really sustained and quite often really detrimental decreases in function from repeatedly pushing into PEM. And that's obviously not something that is helpful for them, for long-term function. It's not a nice situation for anyone involved. And as health professionals, that's part of our doing no harm, is we need to be making sure
mm,
we're not pushing into that. But like you said, we can kind of acknowledge that it is so difficult for a lot of people, and particularly depending on their own physical tolerances. Like, we might have someone who's at the milder end of things, who maybe they can handle, sort of more of the day-to-day stuff around the house, and maybe even very sort of gentle, mild exercise. And we can have people who are completely bedbound, who
mm.
can tolerate very little. So, everyone is going to be different as to where that threshold sits. And there may be people for whom, having super structured, exercise programs, that might be very well outside the realm of reach for them. But that point of, people need to be able to move their bodies to engage in the things they want to be able to do, right? And all of these things about ME/CFS can be true, that PEM can be very harmful, and that we don't want to push them into those PEM flares because of that risk. And there's a risk of doing harm if we do too much. But it can also be true that the consequence of that can be that we then get also compounding issues
Yeah.
with deconditioning and secondary health issues because of a lack of physical activity and because of the secondary effects. And that's, again, not to say that that's the cause of, or what ME/CFS actually is, but we do get that sort of layering. So I guess as an exercise physiologist, I'd imagine that, you guys in particular, I feel like you guys are, very vocal about the role of exercise and movement and the importance of keeping generally physically active in terms of those longer term health outcomes as well. I mean, most people, you'll hear everywhere how good physical activity is for us, but I
Mm.
guess when you think about maybe some of those longer term consequences of some of the things that we are potentially at more risk of if we're not able to sort of, maintain physical activity, what are some of the concerns we might have compounding with ME if we're kind of not able to keep people active?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think hard to know where to begin, but I think where to begin would be that, if we're thinking about somebody who is perhaps newly diagnosed with ME/CFS, and they do, they have previously enjoyed exercise, or it's been part of their life, their mental health is going to be a really big one that might suffer. In fact, I would struggle to recall a single one of my clients with CFS who has not it's like flagged a high score on the DAS, the questionnaire we use for depression, anxiety often. And that's not to say that they have depression, but I would say in the context of having ME/CFS and losing the ability to live their life as they want, then depression is a bit of a no-brainer. It's probably going to happen, acutely at least. Um, and yeah, we know that exercise can be a really helpful tool when people are dealing with mental health issues. So I think that's one of the things, one of the first and foremost things that we see. But then if we're thinking a bit more, I suppose, in the body physiologically different systems, then we we're very likely that, not that ME/CFS is a condition caused by deconditioning, but with reduced movement ability, then deconditioning is probably going to set in. And then there can be a cascade of cardiovascular, metabolic, neurological issues as well that can come from that. So yeah, kind of you name it, an exercise or lack thereof can touch it.
Absolutely. It's such a hard thing, right? Because we don't want to necessarily sound like defeatist or negative about it because, there are people who are going to really struggle to engage with physical activity when they've got ME because of their restrictions. But, I think it's important for us to kind of it sometimes feels like there isn't space to hold both things at the same time. Like, we see these conversations about either we should be, pushing people to, smash themselves with exercise because of the health benefits, or we're seeing, discussions about, resting and sort of, helping to protect against PEM. And that in particular is a really valid stance, but I think quite often we're kind of not discussing or considering I guess the cross section of effects that sometimes we'll get as a result. And I think that's a really
Yeah.
rich space for us to be thinking about this, because I think as health professionals, I think we need to be thinking about, first and foremost, where is this person's capacity, and where are those safe limits where we're not going to be pushing them into PEM. And sometimes that's not, they're not at a space where we can really look at adding much exercise or movement at all. But considering that first and foremost from a safety perspective, and then thinking, well, okay, well, what does this person actually need in order to kind of support their mental and physical health at this time? And, how can we kind of enable that in a way that is safe and adapted to their current capacity? And I don't know, for me, I think the current guidelines, the way they're presented and written, kind of don't necessarily make sense of that or present that really in a way that kind of gives concrete guidance. I mean, I know that the guidelines do say that, exercise can be included in a tailored way if it's part of the patient's goals. So that's probably important for us to note as
Yeah.
well. Um, but I mean, it does feel like there's kind of a real lack of actual specific exercise guidelines for ME as well. Like, I mean, aside from, no GET, there's sort of, there doesn't seem to be much out there in terms of what are some of the principles we can keep in mind, or how we might kind of tailor movement and exercise in a way that might be more safe for someone with ME. Have you come across much, or what's your take on, I guess, that side of things?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's not just a feeling, Soph. It's there are no there are no real guidelines. There's nothing that's universally accepted as this is how someone with ME/CFS should exercise, or here are some guidelines that a clinician can follow. There's nothing. Okay. Actually, that's a bit unfair to say. There's not completely nothing, but it's very sparse out there. And I think many of the listeners, I'm sure, have heard of the PACE trial. Something that it was a trial looking at ME/CFS back in the early 2000s. I think it was published 2011. Essentially, this is going to be a bit of a tangent. I'll come back to the question. Yeah. So the PACE trial was a huge trial in the UK, and the idea was to look at whether graded exercise therapy, so GET, and CBT, so cognitive behavioral therapy, were protocols that might be worth looking at in terms of improving ME/CFS. And there was quite a lot wrong with that study, just to put it really very very politely. With just how it was conducted, and they changed the outcome measures halfway through and all sorts of things. There was a lot of messing around with that study. But it was based on this idea that deconditioning and this lack of wanting to engage with exercise was the fundamental reason for people having ME/CFS, which we now know is absolutely wrong. But get especially was something that was very rigid. It was defined as starting somebody with starting somebody with an exercise amount at a baseline that was achievable. Okay, that's good. That's definitely where we should start. Okay, finding an achievable amount of exercise that does not cause a flare up. But then from there were strict or rigid increases in exercise intensity or duration or a bit of both, irrespective of symptoms. And that's
Mm.
where things started to become a bit questionable, very questionable, you know. And I think that's where the term get has been tarnished. Like I think like just on paper, I'm a fan of that term, like graded exercise therapy. That's yes. Like if we without the baggage, that is what should be occurring. You know, let's gradually introduce exercise, but use our brains and nuance to do that as well. And just like, listening to patient feedback about how their symptoms are going and allowing regressions if we need to. And, you know, lots of autonomy for the client. But that wasn't those things weren't really allowed in the trial. I think, you know, they really wanted to make sure that the trial was very, very structured and, you know, there were few variables, I guess. I think that's probably
And
the background of it.
I think
Yeah.
that's a really important point though, because we do see that a lot. And you sort of touched on before that, because of that, I guess the confusion around terms and what we're actually talking about when we are referring to get and we're referring to exercise and all these things, it sometimes makes having conversations about appropriate movement and exercise quite difficult because people aren't really using the same terminology. I mean, like you said, if we took the context and the baggage and how certain aspects of get have been applied, graded exercise therapy in itself isn't necessarily an inherently problematic term, but
Mm,
it labels a approach that, or at least one application of that has been quite harmful, and that's the label that's often then used. And so it makes sense to me why we kind of use that. I guess for me, what has been helpful now, and it still probably means that I get lost in translation with some people who don't use it the same way. But I think for me, what has been helpful, I tend to see graded exercise therapy and get and try to keep consistent with my terminology about keeping it to that very strict increase at the rigid
yeah.
increases and progressions, because I think from a research perspective, quite often that seems to be how it's been sort of applied and used. So I find it helpful to kind of go like that. And then outside of that, I'm often talking about either, paced activity or just activity and sort of movement in general terms.
Yeah.
But that's not always the case. I know a lot of clinicians who would call what they do graded exercise therapy, but it's actually the complete opposite in the sense that it's exactly what you said. Rather than having these fixed, we are progressing, no matter what happens, it's like, okay, let's find that baseline. Let's work out where you're safe, and then having really, really flexible, yes, increases if people are going okay and they're tolerating it, but
Mm,
importantly, having the capacity for regression because people aren't going to have the same tolerance all the time. So having that
yeah.
ability to actually map it to symptoms and to go, okay, we need to keep you within that energy envelope. How do we adjust that is kind of, the overarching, I guess, principle of what we're trying to do. But I know clinicians who are doing that and would probably call that GET because that's what feels intuitive to them. So it
Mm,
makes it really
mm,
complicated. And if that's complicated for me as a clinician, I can't imagine how complicated it would be for a patient who's trying to work out
yeah.
who's safe to see, who's not safe to see. It's a minefield, really.
It's a massive minefield. And look, I would say that, you know, as if someone is listening to this and has ME/CFS, then they're right to be cautious. You know, if they do see, you know, get maybe on a website or talked about, you know, they're certainly right to just question that and go and just ask, you know, if they're engaging with a clinician, what do you mean exactly by that? You know, because yeah, you know, if you do jump on Google, you might come across some advice that get is still something that is can be beneficial, you know, because we know that you know what pops on up on Google is highly subjective to the person who's searching. So that may well, you know, some old piece of information out there might come up, you know, and that might be something that somebody grabs onto and uses. So yeah, like as a patient, it's very important just to inquire about like, hey, so if we're going to be engaging with exercise, then what does that mean exactly? And what does get mean to you? Because yeah, you and I understand that nuance very, very well, but not, as we were sort of saying before, like the people going through uni in our era did not get very good education and understanding about this sort of stuff. And in fact, I would say that probably when I went through GET was recommended on that slide, if I remember correctly.
Those incremental, like fixed progression sort of programs that really push increasing physical activity, there are still rehab programs and clinics that, like, this is the foundation of what they're offering for people. And I want to acknowledge that too, is that, yeah, it's really tricky because, yes, there may be clinicians out there who actually do practice in a much more flexible and significantly safer way for people with
Yeah.
ME who might just label what they do GET, but it's probably not, quite a different beast compared to, some of these
Yeah.
the issues like within the PACE trial. But at the same time, there are still clinics out there who use GET in that very rigid format, and they do so
Yeah.
because they are still believing that that is something that is appropriate for
Mm.
ME/CFS. It's sad that that happens, but I mean, the PACE trial, part of the challenges we've had with that is that that was a huge trial. It was a very well funded study in the UK. It had a lot of traction. It influenced a lot of reviews because of the power and the size of the study. And so, for quite a few years, it lent a lot of weight to this idea that GET is evidence-based practice. And it was
Yeah.
really only when we started having patients who were quite vocal about their experiences and the fact that, actually, no, this approach really harmed me, and we're concerned
Mm.
about the fact that this is something that's being pushed. And I mean, if you're interested, all you have to do is do a Google search about this, and you will hear patient stories about, people who have had really horrible experiences with it. And then, like you said, when we started then, getting into the methods used in that trial, it became a bit questionable about whether the results they were seeing were, actually that
Yeah.
valid or robust. But I think one of the other things too that's important, because sometimes when we're talking about research in exercise and fatigue, I think it's really important we're also really specific about who we're actually talking about, because chronic fatigue as a symptom and
Yeah.
ME are two very different things, right? Like,
Yeah. That's a great point. Yeah.
and because I mean, you'd actually be a great person to ask about this, right? Like, so with, when we're talking about chronic fatigue as a symptom, like, there are lots of conditions that present with chronic fatigue, right? Like, what sort of conditions, can you think of where people might present with like fatigue as a symptom?
Yeah, again, if we're just using that terminology, without the knowing about like what chronic or ME/CFS chronic fatigue actually is as a medically recognized condition, then yeah, burnout. You can get a lot of fatigue with. A lot of cancer patients who are undergoing certain treatments can get fatigue. Um, Neurological conditions can lead to fatigue. Getting older can lead to fatigue, like it's nothing as benign as that. Yes, chronic fatigue, if we sort of boil that down to meaning ongoing or persistent fatigue, then that features in a lot of conditions. Me, CFS, and I'm so grateful that like there is now a pretty clear and agreed upon definition of ME/CFS, and it is that, number one, persisting fatigue. Yes, that's been going on for X amount of months, 3 or 6, whatever it is. PEM being probably the number one feature, and post-exertional malaise. That's really worth just understanding exactly what that is. That is an amount of fatigue. In my view, I think this will probably be not too far from the official definition, but it's an amount of fatigue that is so disproportionate to the amount of activity that was just that preceded it, that it is it's just mind-bogglingly huge. Okay, and it doesn't get better. Somebody with, say, burnout, or somebody who is undergoing cancer treatment, yes, they're going to experience probably some post-exertional fatigue, but it's going to be pretty well in proportion, and they might be able to sleep it off generally, or rest it off after a day or two, that sort of thing. PEM does not respond that quickly. I would say it does respond to rest, but over a much longer period of time. It can be shorter, but let's say up to a week, or maybe even more than that. So PEM is that's the defining feature. plus sleep disturbances and I think OI symptoms as
Yeah.
well. So it's good that we've got that really firm definition. And for the most part, just clinically speaking, from what I see, then that's a really solid, reliable definition as well. So yeah, I think in the pace trial there was some there was some uncertainty about whether everyone actually had ME/CFS and therefore they had PEM. Um, so yeah, some people probably did get great results from, increasing exercise, increasing their fitness, muscle strength, and all of that sort of stuff, movement, mental health. Some people probably did get better in
Yeah,
that trial. Good. That's
absolutely.
awesome.
Yeah.
But so many were not. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think in the PACE trial in particular, a big part of that was the exact clinical criteria they'd used to define the diagnosis of ME/CFS, because the older criteria that they had used didn't include PEM as that defining feature. So
Right.
it was possible for people who were experiencing chronic fatigue as a symptom,
Yeah.
to not who didn't necessarily meet the stricter definition that it had PEM as a defining feature now. And I think that that is really important when we're then interpreting that research, because we have research shows that people who have ME/CFS, who have PEM, do actually have different physiological responses to exercise and to movement.
Mm,
And that's part of why our approach needs to be different, and why some of the recommendations for, the ways in which we might tackle fatigue as an isolated symptom, potentially, yeah, that sort of gradual increase in exercise
mm,
is a much more appropriate sort of recommendation. But, with PEM, it's a sort of a different ballgame because people do respond differently. One thing
mm.
again, like as a physio, it's sort of something that we don't learn heaps about as we're going through, but I know that there has been some research sort of done in the space of cardiopulmonary testing, exercise testing, and sort of looking at the responses of people who have ME/CFS compared to those who don't, and sort of showing some of those responses. Could you comment on some of the things we see in terms of some of those physiological responses that might be different in this group compared to others?
Yeah, the cardiopulmonary exercise testing, the gold standards for doing that test is you basically get somebody on a piece of exercise equipment, treadmill, usually a bike, because it just offers a bit more stability in terms of dialing in intensities and speed. But you're measuring, so they're wearing a mask to measure their oxygen exchange and gas exchanges. Often the lab assistants will also be just taking some finger prick blood as well, just to look at different blood markers of what's going on in the body when somebody is exercising. And from there, you can get a really, really good reading on a couple of things: total cardiovascular fitness for somebody when they're doing these sorts of exercise tests, and metabolically what's going on in their body. Okay, at a quite a cellular level. Okay, so there's a lot of detail that can be found. So some studies that have been done have been to get some people with ME/CFS with the PEM, okay, and healthy control subjects. And so day one, let's get everyone to do an exercise fitness test, measure all of their bloods and their gas exchanges and all that sort of stuff, plot the data, get a really good idea about how somebody's body performs under exercise loads. Get everyone to sleep it off, have a night off, or maybe a day in between even, just to fully recover, and then test again. And what they found was that there is an enormous difference between healthy control subjects, and what their ability was in terms of exercise performance, but also what their body was doing in terms of gas exchanges and things like lactate and other things in the blood metabolically, versus a ME/CFS patient with PEM. Okay, so that was probably one of the most important recent studies, and I think there's probably been a couple of studies, but
Yeah.
relatively recently. We're talking sort of, 2018, 19, 2020, that sort of era. So really high quality studies and very recent studies showing that there's actually physiological differences between somebody who's healthy and someone who has chronic fatigue syndrome. Okay. And that's just like such an important smoking gun. It's so validating to go, despite the fact that if you go to a GP, all of your bloods are going to be fine, mostly, right? Every single scan under the sun will be thrown at you, rightly so. Okay. But also, your GP is going to go, you're healthy on paper, maybe you should see a psychologist or something. That's the classic. Um, yeah.
Right.
Hashtag not all GPs. Um, some great GPs out there. So, okay, right, there's something physiological. It doesn't get picked up on medical testing.
Absolutely. And I'd imagine too, when, thinking about what that exercise testing actually involves, it kind of involves pushing pretty well to people's limit
Yes.
to kind of test where things kick in. And
Yeah, it's a
I had
fitness
someone
test. Yeah.
I had someone ask me about this the other day about, well, if it shows this, could that be used as a test for ME/CFS? Because at the moment, there's no clear
Mm.
one test that we can do. Like, I mean, I think, on the basis of that, yeah, it probably could. But I mean, I think it raises some
At
really
what
significant
cost?
concerns about, yeah, exactly at what cost. Like,
Yeah.
we might get a good sense that they've got ME/CFS when we look at that drop off in function on that second day of testing.
Yeah.
But yeah, are we gonna, like, the risk of that is pretty
Yeah.
high.
I'd rather someone just fill out a questionnaire and I'd
Yes.
go, yeah, you probably have this. That's close. That's good enough for me. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And
Yeah.
and I think I think that's it's an important and really interesting study showing that not just that aerobic ability and energy production is impaired, compared to, the normal population, but you've then also got that lack of recovery the second day. And
Mm.
it's that sort of delayed response. And what I found really interesting, there was also sort of some follow-up studies that were done, and they've sort of since shown that it's not just when we compare it to healthy controls, that they've actually compared it to people who do have chronic fatigue as a symptom, like other fatiguing illnesses, but not ME/CFS. And they've found that
What a great study.
even when you compare, so I believe it was MS they were comparing to. So people with MS who had fatigue, when they did the same testing and they looked at on the day fitness, but then also when they brought them back the following day, what was the recovery? And they found that
Mm.
even when you compare them to people who have other fatiguing illnesses, people with ME/CFS had a significantly reduced recovery. So we only really see it in ME/CFS rather than
Mm.
conditions that might present with fatigue.
I just want to, I suppose, spell out that on that day one of exercise testing, I don't think there was really a significant difference between the healthy controls or maybe more so in that sort of chronic fatigue versus ME/CFS, those sorts of trials. I think performance was not too dissimilar. So I think what that is telling us is that this is a condition where it's not so much about somebody with fatigue being unable to exert themselves. I often say to people, when we're having this sort of discussion, if I instructed you right now to do some hill sprints, you could probably do that. Okay. So it's not that you cannot do this and your body is just collapsing. It's what happens after. It's the recovery period that is very, very different. Somebody recovers and somebody doesn't recover, basically, or in an expected timely fashion. So I always think that's a really important thing to communicate, especially people who maybe know some people with chronic fatigue, because they're going to see people with chronic fatigue syndrome doing things. They're not going to see people in their home recovering for the next week. So yeah, that I'll get off my soapbox now.
No, no, no. Please stay on your soapbox for as long as you
Okay.
like, because it's so important. Because I would agree with that, and I mean, I've been pretty open on past episodes of the podcast about my own experience with ME, and I
Yeah.
would say that's me to a T. Like I literally, I'm someone who I literally for a job work with people, trying to help them work out how to effectively navigate their own symptoms and to try and pace their activities and do things in a sensible way that's going to minimize
Mhm.
PEM. And I am so notoriously bad at it. And
Yeah.
and I think that that's a really important point, because absolutely, like I remember maybe 6 months or so ago, um, I got really, really annoyed how much I'd had to restrict, to the point where, in probably a very unhelpful fashion, my brain just went, you know what? Fuck it. I'm just gonna I'm just gonna do the thing because I'm sick of not being able to do the thing. And
Yeah.
I went out and like completely like ripped out half my garden, and I was weeding. Like we had weeds that were like shoulder height, and I went crazy and was out there for hours. And I think I just mentally like shut myself down and was like, I'm just going to ignore literally everything happening in my body for the next little while because my rage is overwhelming me at this point. And it
Yeah.
cooked me. Like, it was, you'd look at me going to do that and you go, man, not many people could actually go out and spend hours weeding. Like, that's
Mm,
hard physical work.
mm,
But the cost to me after was so huge. Like, it was weeks and weeks of being unwell
yeah.
and very restricted in how much I could do. And
Mm,
in hindsight, that was, as an informed health professional who knows far better than that, that was probably an incredibly unsafe and silly thing for me to do. It certainly set me back. But I think it just illustrates that point that you're saying there, that, people are often able to do things, and quite often with life stuff, there's often very strategic decisions about the pros and cons of deciding whether or not to do something or not. And there may be things in people's lives that they know are probably likely to flare them up, but for one reason or another, they are making the informed decision that actually this is something that I'm going to choose to engage with because it's something that is important to me, whether that's maybe a loved one's wedding or there's some event or
yeah,
something that
absolutely.
is important. And, I think I don't personally feel as a physio that it's my job to come in and tell people authoritatively that you cannot do this thing, you should not do this thing, because
Yeah.
there's, you know, there's so many sides to it, and it's ultimately about the patient and their priorities and their goals. It is my job to make sure that they're at least aware of the risks of doing that, and to work with them to see if there's ways maybe we can help them engage in that thing in a bit of a safer way, or put some strategies in place to try and, soften things. But it's not my place to say to someone, hey, don't do this thing. You're not
Yeah.
allowed to do this thing. So it's, thank you for
Yeah.
raising that.
That's a good. I'm enthusiastically nodding for people who are just listening and not watching. Like, absolutely. And yeah, I never want to stop people from doing things that they want to do. I want them to be informed. I want them to have to be able to just, have the resources within them to think, okay, there's this thing that's alive in me right now. I want to go and do this activity that is really, really important to me. Like you said, whether it's a wedding or whether it's like, hosting Christmas lunch, or whether it's, I remember I remember I had a client who wanted to go to one of the 4-day music festivals here. And it was very early on in the treatment. And he said, oh, should I do this? Should I go? And I said, well, what do you think will happen afterwards? He goes, oh, I'll probably crash. And I said, probably, most likely, yes. But in knowing that, is it worth it? Is it worth, seeing some of your some of your favorite music acts? Is it worth, camping and having a wild time with your friends? Is that all going to be worth it? And he said, yeah, then that's awesome. That's treating someone as a whole person, not an illness, really. That is saying, yeah, this person understands what's going to happen, but that fun is a core memory, that's going to be in there for life. So I just want people to understand, and probably where I might have a bit more of a stern talking to is like, just don't do that every weekend, please.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like,
Like, there's a
that's a
there's a
one-off
limit.
activity. So,
Like, yeah, we don't wanna be
yeah,
tempting fate routinely, and the goal is to
yeah,
get, if we kind of sometimes think of it of like, if we can get, like, 95% of our activity
yeah,
and our movement within that sort of safe, able sort of bandwidth, we're working within our energy envelope. And again, just making sure that people really do understand the risks. Like, I think as health professionals, we don't wanna be too cavalier with saying, "Oh, look, you'll probably flare up, and if it matters to you, go do it." I think we still need
mm,
to, I guess, communicate the potential risk and gravity of PEM flares, and make sure that person is making a really informed decision.
mm,
I think I mean, why are we in the game to begin with, right? Well, I would assume that most health professionals are there because they want to help their patients. We want to see people be able to do the things they want to do, to engage with life in the way that they want to, and
yeah,
there's no simple ways about that. That's the tricky thing. And I guess, like, thinking then about coming back maybe to more of the exercise and movement side of things then, we've sort of spoken about, how sometimes there are situations where maybe people are very motivated. They want exercise is something they want to be doing, or there may be a consideration where we know that there are maybe some sort of measures that we ideally would like to have in place to minimize the risk of someone's long-term deconditioning or complications. So an example that comes to mind is, I see many patients who are, pretty well, bedbound by their symptoms, and have
yeah,
very limited physical capacity. And we obviously have to be so careful with Pem in that situation because their threshold's already at the floor. But often what we're trying to do is to think, okay, well, is there any little bit of anything that can at least maintain or prevent secondary complications? So that could
Yeah.
be alternating their positioning through the day so they're not developing contractures of joints. Maybe it is some really gentle range of motion exercises. So they're just
Yeah.
gentle stretches, broken up. And again, it has to come down to how people are responding. There are certainly people I've seen who can't even tolerate those things, and that's important
Yeah.
for us to recognize the limits. I think you've touched on some really important points already about finding that baseline and then
Mm-hmm.
having that ability to very slowly increase but also regress and be very flexible with things.
Mm-hmm.
I'm interested in your take because I know that I guess the evidence base isn't great in terms of stuff we can look to in terms of types of exercise that might be more or less uh, suitable for people with ME/CFS, or things we might be able to kind of manipulate to make things a bit more safer and a bit more tolerable for people. Like from memory, and jump in and correct me if I'm wrong or you've seen anything different, but when you sort of ignore the sort of pace trial and the get side of things, I know there have been a few papers that have sort of found that some really, really gentle walking programs, some people can be of benefit if they're done, without pushing into symptoms. I know that there has been some suggestion that potentially things like hydrotherapy can be a bit gentler because it's sort of
Mm-hmm.
reducing the demand on the body. But there really seems to be not a great deal sort of comparing things like, if we compare things like, aerobic versus anaerobic exercise or strength
Yeah.
exercise versus sort of cardio based stuff. There's not really a whole heap to go on. It's interesting when we're then thinking about, again, how do we kind of use that to inform our management and what might we need to be careful of? Because I mean, we still definitely don't understand the ins and outs of exactly what's happening with ME/CFS,
Mm.
but broadly speaking, one of the big things that's been mentioned is that sort of impairment to aerobic energy production, right? Like that's often the big thing we kind of hear about. Like I
Yeah.
mean, at XFiz, you're going to be far better at discussing this than me, but
I'll
um,
try.
the aerobic versus anaerobic energy, are you happy to kind of maybe explain that a little bit? Because I'm aware that that's
Yeah.
obviously stuff that people haven't heard much about.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so anaerobic and aerobic, we're talking metabolically. These are the two main ways that our body can generate and use energy. So every thing, every function that our body does requires metabolic energy, and that can be through aerobic means or anaerobic means. That refers to whether oxygen involved in that process or not. So that's the real fundamental thing that we're talking about here. When it comes to exercise, it's usually a question of intensity. Okay. So I'll use some examples. So let's just bring it right back down to a basic thing. When we're resting, say we're lying down, there's not much movement going on, but there are functions going on in our body. Breathing. So we've got this diaphragm muscle, which is moving. We've got this heart muscle that is moving. That's going to require energy, and that's going to be aerobic. So that's a very, very low intensity, gentle muscular contraction with those muscles there. That is aerobic. So typically when we're thinking about lower intensity exercise or movement or function in the body, that's going to be an aerobic process. Okay. Hopefully that makes sense to most people. As exercise intensity increases, so we're getting more force through the muscles, more rapid contractions. So if we bring it into a sport like sprinting, running, sprinting, that is going to be, if we think about like a 100-meter sprint where it's short and sharp, it's all over, at a professional level, it's all over in like less than 10 seconds these days. Almost all of that effort is anaerobic. Okay? Now it's not completely black and white like that, but we can say that 99% of that effort is capable because of anaerobic processes. Anaerobic processes can only occur in very, very short amounts of time. They're not sustainable. So once somebody's running for longer, they're going to slow down, and that intensity is just not going to be charged through, yeah, non-oxygenated routes of metabolism. Very, very highly taxing on the body. It's also where a lot of fitness gains can occur. So if that's your focus, but very, very taxing on the body. So, um, what studies have found with ME/CFS is that when somebody is exercised to a high enough intensity where the anaerobic pathways are being utilized, HEM is an almost guarantee. So that's almost, not always, but almost guaranteed to occur. Um, so when we're thinking about exercise for somebody with ME/CFS, we are absolutely wanting to stick within the aerobic ranges, the lower intensity ranges. Um, and yeah, I think that's a nice guideline just in and of itself. Like if, somebody who has a patient, so if someone's listening and has a patient with ME/CFS, um, and they want to engage, like they've had a discussion, they want to engage with, give somebody some exercise for this sort of stuff, it's got to be super low intensity. Yeah.
Often, what I've heard beyond just the intensity, because sustained efforts will also tend to gradually sort of push people up towards that hitting that threshold, right, as well. So
Yeah.
often a common thing for people with ME you'll hear is even with like low intensity exercise, it's when it's really sustained they might then start to have some problems with PEM and with ME, that sort of threshold for kicking into anaerobic is actually
Mm,
lower as well. So the
yeah,
I guess
correct.
tolerance and the threshold is sometimes a bit trickier to navigate. I know people do this different ways, and I'm interested to see actually, but in your practice, because that can be a really tricky thing to monitor, right? Intensity is such a individual thing, and it's sometimes tricky as a clinician if you're going to be talking to people about how people can use it to sort of pace, not just with formal exercise programs. People might not even be doing those, but just day-to-day activities as well. That's a
Mm.
helpful thing to keep in mind. What do you tend to use, or like how do you approach sort of monitoring that for someone? Do you use any particular sort of tools, or like I know heart rate monitoring and things like that are sort of being more broadly used, but like how do you tend to approach it in your practice?
Yeah. The idea, so measuring anaerobic versus aerobic is impossible, outside the lab. Okay. And yeah, you're absolutely correct. So I suppose there is normative data to give us an idea about, like, if you're a certain age, this is roughly where your anaerobic threshold is going to kick in. Um, that does not apply to someone with ME/CFS. Okay, so that was also one of the things that was found during these, exercise trials. So they found that, wow, these people have a really, because that can be measured metabolically through bloods and oxygen. These people have a really, really low um, anaerobic threshold. Okay, versus yeah, general public. So we're already dealing with something that is, very, very, yeah, very low in terms of intensity. Theoretically, yes, heart rate can be used as kind of a measure of where anaerobic threshold kicks in. But we're also, but again, outside of the lab, it's very, very hit and miss, very tedious. If you sort of think about those, some people might have come across those age predicted um, heart rate measurements, where one of them is like if you take the number 220 minus a person's age, that gives you a theoretical heart rate maximum, basically the maximum um, speed that their heart rate can achieve. Not very reliable at all in anyone, in any population, okay, at all. None of them are. They're sort of as good as BMI calculations. They're kind of like a very quick guess. Um, so heart rate is something that I don't really use. And then, I mean, also, if we sort of bring in the fact that probably half of the patients that I see who have ME um, also have orthostatic intolerance or POTS or something like that, where they just sneeze and their heart rate's 150.
Yeah.
So yeah, so it's not a very reliable tool. Probably the main things that you educate people on is just like the intensity scale. So there is a scale called the Borg scale by a bloke called Borg back in whenever, where it's a very simple scale, 0 to 10. There's two versions, but I think 0 to 10 just keeps it nice and simple. 0 is where somebody is not exercising at all. They are not exerting at all. Okay. Nice and clear. 10 is you are you're running for your life. You are at absolute maximum capacity. You cannot possibly run any or exercise any harder than this, that would be a 10. Probably around about the 2 to 3, which would equate to light or very light exercise, is a good starting place. Now, I have patients who can actually tolerate higher intensities, and we've been okay to sort of test that, and that doesn't really cause them PEM. So I like to just start people. Like if somebody I don't know or somebody who doesn't have any exercise experience, then starting them around about that sort of, very light. It's frustratingly boring for them, and if they're really frustratingly bored, then that's a good sign. I would rather that than send someone away going, yep, you can do 10 minutes of walking and I want your heart rate to reach like 120, for them to come back the next week and go, well, I was in bed for the whole week because of that. And we don't know why. We don't know where was that threshold, where was that cutoff. So I'd rather start off people very, very slow and light, and then we can just inch it up. This is where that um, this is where I like the term get, because we're actually increasing exercise, but, in a nuanced way, carefully, until we find some resistance, until we find, okay, the body's saying no to this. So that's where we
Absolutely.
sort of, then we know for certain this is how much or how intense you can do. And, yeah, just want to also just bring it back to around to what you were saying before. Yes, duration matters as well. So people can be doing very low intensity exercise or movement. They can do that up to a point. It might be minutes if they're really severe. It might be 20 minutes or 30 minutes if they're not so severe or beyond. So yeah.
Absolutely. And that's interesting that you mentioned the effort side of things, because when you said, oh, some people can tolerate higher effort and not necessarily trigger PEM, it made me think about, again, because a big part of my practice, particularly working with people, has been, how can we try and meet people where they're at, and obviously
Mm.
being as safe as we can, and yes, stabilizing symptoms. We're trying to avoid PEM, but also dealing with the reality that quite often people want to be exercising and don't want to stop doing what they're doing.
All
So
have to be. Mm.
yeah, will have to be. So it's been this kind of learning experience of working out, okay, well, what can we change about the nature of this exercise that might work better for you and your system and how your body is
Mm.
responding to it? And one of the things that I found really interesting, and actually I came across it because it was actually my own, I was trying to work out how I could keep doing what I wanted to be doing, because I was keen to continue gym after I'd had my flare.
Mm.
And, I'd come across the idea of, sort of really low volume strength training,
Mm.
which I
Yeah.
had not really come across before. But basically, for those of you that aren't familiar with that, the idea is that it's strength training. The particular sort of program that I was following, it did sort of quite a low number of sets and reps. It was relatively quite small amount, so not going in and doing 20 or 30 repetitions, which is where you might be risking getting into that sort of aerobic threshold sort of level. It was very
Yeah.
low. It was sort of like 2 sets of 5 reps. And actually, I started unweighted, but I was able to add weight to those. And so the actual weight I was lifting was actually reasonably high intensity. Like if I was reporting like the intensity of the actual lifting I was doing, it probably would have been sitting at around that sort of 7 or an 8 by the time I'd kind of tested and very carefully, built myself up and sort of went right. But I was sort of squatting 40 kilos. I was deadlifting sort of 40 kilos. So,
Yeah.
decent weights and intensity. But the key thing was that I was only doing a handful of reps.
Mm.
And between every set, I had extended rest periods so I would have 3 to 5 minutes or longer of just sitting and resting between sets, so that
Yeah.
I wasn't kicking my system into that protracted sort of level. And I was only doing it, I started twice a week, and then I was able to kind of do 3 times a week. So I was doing, again, very low volume. If you look at the total number of squats or exercises across the week, it looks like very minimal, but the research actually sort of says that, I mean, anything is going to be better than nothing, assuming it's not causing us harm. But
Absolutely.
for me, I actually sort of saw significant sort of, I guess, strength gains. I can't necessarily say that it helped my PEM thresholds in day to day. So I don't want to
Yeah.
suggest I exercised my way out of that. But it did certainly make day to day activities feel easier because I had more muscular capacity. So, that was my experience. I know people have sometimes had the opposite experience and they don't tolerate any sort of weight training at all. But yeah, I think I found that interesting. It was something I'd not considered. Is that, I guess, when you think about some of the patients you've seen who might be sort of more inclined towards things like weight training, have you sort of observed any patterns? Like, do people just seem to be completely different in how they respond, or do you find that there are certain tweaks that you've found sort of more helpful more often? Yeah, I guess what's your take?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, first, I want to just comment on, the fact that if you were lifting 40 kilos, you were absolutely, utilizing your anaerobic pathways, right? So it tells us that there's a lot of nuance. Um, and also the other thing I would just say there that yes, anything and literally anything is better than nothing at all. Moving your limbs through range of motion, unweighted, is categorically better than doing nothing, not doing that. So if it's, I think it's important just to try to find something that somebody can do. It's going to benefit them on neurological level, cardiovascular level, mental health level, that sort of thing. So yeah, that's fantastic that you found a way. On paper, it's certainly not the approach I would have taken, but I see a really, really broad variety of people's capabilities, right to the point where, I can think of a handful of clients who are just unaffected by physical exercise, or at least the physical exercise that they are doing, and I would say that a lot of people are doing, yeah, walking, even going to the gym. In one extreme case, I remember somebody who was participating in weekly sort of boot camp style, like personal training exercise, and that was not causing PEM. Other things were, like cognitive stresses were absolutely causing PEM and big problems. But physical exercise, their body just gave them a free pass. I can't explain it. I just can't. But it was a real thing. So yeah, there's a lot of experimentation just to be done. And yeah, what we're talking about here, with this very light, very minimal activity, short duration, all that sort of stuff, it's a starting point. If we can find some confidence that their body is responding okay to it, or well, even, so maybe it's improving things, then we can start to just explore that direction, I think.
Yeah,
So yeah,
absolutely.
there's no one particular type of exercise or one particular factor in exercise that we need to really hone in on. I think I will say, apart from, yeah, big rest breaks between sets and reps, I think that's a really, really smart thing to do. Um, a rest day after, so no exercise on consecutive days, and just no rush, just giving yourself lots of space and time. And I think also just, exercise is something that for me, I spend a very little amount of time talking about, in spite of the 7 years of study that I've done in this area. I spend such little time talking about exercise. It's further down the track. I want people to be really informed about their condition, like what are the ins and outs of it, what causes problems. I really want people to have a foundational understanding of pacing and a foundational understanding about, like, how does their body achieve rest? Because guess what? If you exercise, you need a rest to get the benefits. So yeah, there's actually not that much point in exercising if you don't know how to rest and recover properly. So yeah, I think rest is a real key.
Absolutely. And I really like, because I think often we hear exercise, we think, oh, it's exercise that gets us stronger, and it's exercise that does this. And it's like indirectly, yes.
Mm, mm,
It's actually not the
yeah,
exercise itself. It's what our body does in response to the exercise that helps us get
yeah,
fitter, stronger. And the reality is that, depending on what else is happening in our system, our
mm,
body may not be responding in a way that's actually leading to those positive health gains. Like, and I use the example of, like a marathon runner. If you could say that, training and running is good for your fitness, but if you take the example of the marathon runner who is completely killing themselves overtraining, they're not
mm,
sleeping well, they're not eating well, maybe they've been sick. Most people kind of intuitively would understand that, you're probably not going to get the same fitness gain from continuing to run and push through as you would if you were better rested, you were, eating
yeah,
well. And it's because it influences our body's ability to respond to that stimulus that it's getting in a productive way. And
yeah.
I think that's where understanding someone's current capacity and baseline, and I'd agree with you, as much as we're here to talk about exercise, like, it is probably off I wouldn't say the last thing I talk to people about, but it is pretty low on the list when it comes to when I first start seeing someone with ME, because so much of it is, how do we get symptoms stabilizing? What does the rest of your life look like? What are the other factors we need to sort of address, and how do we kind of promote that sort of rest and recovery first? Because we need that so that there's any chance of your system being able to adapt in a positive way to
Mm,
exercise and activity. And there are going to be some people for whom exercise isn't necessarily a goal for them. They're not passionate about it. Their tolerance is low.
yeah.
Exercise is not always going to be a suitable option for every patient. It's something that I feel like you've touched on a little bit throughout, an idea that we haven't sort of spoken about as explicitly. I think exercise itself conjures up very specific ideas about what we're talking
Mm,
about. When we hear exercise, we kind of, I don't know about you, as an EP working in this space, you've probably got a much more rounded, less stereotypical view of exercise. But I think for most people, we hear exercise and we think either going to the gym and doing, X amount of sets and reps, or
mm,
maybe walking or running. Like, we have that very sort of rigid idea of what exercise looks like. Maybe exercise isn't the right word for a lot of what we're talking about all the time. Exercise might, for some people, be part of it in a more formal sense, but really, like, often what we're talking about is movement, and it's not
yeah.
always a dedicated program. It's, maybe it is talking to people about what movement do they have in their day. And for a lot of people, maybe the focus is actually on, in considering their day-to-day movements, the incidental things that they are doing as part of existing as a human, whether that's, their household
Yeah.
stuff, whether that's their, personal care, all these things. That's all physical activity as well. And so sometimes it's about using those as avenues to, for movement, and activity, as opposed to giving people really structured programs. But yeah, what's your thoughts on that, or how do you tend to think about that sort of distinction, movement, exercise?
Yeah, I mean, it's all a continuum really, and yeah, we can. You're right. I think that it's fair to say that the term exercise implies some sort of very, it's very structured and very intentional. People talk about exercise in terms of going to the gym or something that sort of fits into their daily or weekly regimen, that is very, very purposeful. So, but that's not always what I mean by talking about exercise. So yeah, I do very interchangeably talk about exercise and movement and physical activity, as I'm sure you probably do as well. So movement. Let's just think about the fundamental word of movement. Movement has benefits. Okay, and this is what I was saying before. Anything is better than nothing. Even there's often a big discussion that I have to have with my more athletic or physically fit and active clients about, let's talk about the definition of this, and let's talk about how meaningful just moving is. I know it's not at your level, and yeah, unfortunately, we're going to probably see some fitness drop off. That's kind of the nature of this, really. But just like with any sort of injury, like if there was a broken leg or a broken limb or some sort of injury, exercise and movement would have to be modified, and we would have to consider the idea that fitness and maybe overall health, secondary to reduced fitness, is going to drop off. So it's really just about minimizing those negative impacts. Okay, so again, we always just we can't really fight the system too much. We have to come back to whatever the body is going to be able to tolerate, because PEM is going to happen, you know, one way or the other, if we're trying to fight that or push through it. Um, yeah, so it's just a matter of working with what we can, redefining what we mean by exercise and movement, and just understanding that any sort of movement, even unloaded, just body weight stuff, stretching is actually healthy for us. That does have benefits for us, and of course, a lot of people want to be doing a lot more, and that's an amazing goal. That's where exercise for me is often around. It's paired up with people's goals, like where do you want to be? How is this illness impacting you, and what are we trying to overcome? And yeah, sometimes it's, yep, I want to be bike riding or running or going to the gym. For other people, depending on their life circumstances, it is more about functional movement. I want to be tending to my garden more. I want to be walking my pets, or I want to be spending more time, more quality time with children in my life, whatever it might be. And it's really just about going, okay, cool. Exercise is really just a tool,
Mm.
and like you said, it is the stimulus that then leads to those adaptations in our body. So we don't have to be too puritanical about how we do it.
And I think too, like that's a really great way of framing it. Any exercise prescription that might be involved in care, like it should always be with the view of helping that person to achieve what they want to be achieving.
Yeah.
But it may also be there are other ways in which we might be able to also help that happen too. So if we are working with people who maybe for whatever reason, maybe their system is not, their tolerance or their adaptation to movement is just not there, and they're not able to have much progression in their physical capacity with
Mm.
exercise for whatever reason. If we're orienting to those goals, it opens up our opportunities to explore other things as well, where it's like, okay, maybe it's not about we're intrinsically changing that person's capacity for this activity. Maybe we have to expand our lens outwards a bit and go, well, if someone's goal is that they want to be able to access the community and go and participate as part of their craft group, what are some of the other things that we can do that might actually help facilitate their ability to do that? And that might not be building their intrinsic physical capacity. That could be, would this person potentially benefit from maybe some mobility aids to help, reduce some of the
Yeah.
demand on them or to improve their safety getting out. Sensory load can be a huge PEM flare. Maybe
Yeah.
when they're accessing the community, maybe it is, hey, do we explore whether or not experimenting with things like sunglasses or noise reducing headphones and these sorts of things? Maybe that will help sort of reduce some of that overall demand and
Yeah.
give you a bit more breathing room to be able to then go and access the community. Can we look at what sort of seating or even sort of opportunities to lay down at craft group, that those sorts of things. I think sometimes, I know physios are very guilty of it. I think sometimes we get so locked into how do we change the person's state of function when it's actually like, some of the
Yeah.
most impactful things that I do with people, I think, are sometimes some of those really pragmatic sort of environmental accommodations, and they can sometimes make a really profound difference for people before
Yeah.
we even start looking at, activity and exercise. And they're probably honestly the things that I look at first before I start looking at building exercise. But I think it's a good reminder, given we've spent so much time talking about exercise today, just that it is only one facet and it's not going to be the only facet. For some people, it's not necessarily going to be in a super appropriate or central part of their care. Many people might be limited in how much they can do, but if we're keeping it oriented around goals, we can always take those different frames as well.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%. I agree. It's really just about using whatever tool works. And if there are aids, then we sort of have a discussion about just, reducing the overall load on the system, might actually be enough to make exercise or movement feel a bit more comfortable and sustainable for somebody as well,
Yeah.
for sure. Yeah.
Absolutely. Fantastic. Well, look, that feels like a pretty good place to leave it. I'm sure we could be here all afternoon talking about this sort of stuff. Is there anything before we finish up that you can think of that we haven't spoken about that you'd like to add, or maybe any key takeaways you'd like listeners to walk away with after today's episode?
Look, I think we had a really comprehensive discussion about everything. Yeah, look, I think, as we were just ending that discussion, talking, just making exercise approachable, as a tool and not the be all end all tool at all. It's really just like, if this is something that appeals to you, and you've got a CFS, if exercise is something that's valuable to you, it really just does need to be approached with a lot of caution, a lot of respect, but it can be done.
Excellent. Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us, Rob. It's been super valuable for me, and I know that it will be equally as valuable for anyone who's listening. Where is the best place if people are keen to connect with you and find you?
Yep. Best place is healthrive.com.au. That's my website. Social media, as we mentioned at the start, is just not my favorite thing. Um, I may dip in and out of that. I don't know. At this point, I'm inclined not to and just distance myself from it. So probably the website. Yeah, that's where I'll keep everyone informed. And I'm also being told by marketing people that I need to start a blog, so I'll probably do that at some point. I have a
Excellent.
blog. It's just a bit dusty.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, look, yeah, anyone who's interested in more information, definitely go check out the website. I'm sure if there's a future blog that makes its way up there eventually, that'll also be the place to find it. But thank you so much for your time, Rob. I really appreciate it. Always great to chat to you. And thanks everyone for tuning in, and hope to see you next time. See you.
So yeah.
If you enjoyed this episode, we'd love for you to share it with a friend or a colleague, or maybe even leave us a quick review. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. If you've got an idea for a topic or a guest that you'd love to hear, definitely send us an email at podcast@vivepainfatigue.com.au. If you're interested in more resources or information, head to our website where you can find out more about our clinical services and our professional education. Until next time, take care.